Welcome to a journey into one of the darkest chapters in the history of Essex County, Massachusetts. Before we dive in, I want you to share in the comments where you are watching from and the time of day or night you are listening. It is always fascinating to know where and when these forgotten stories reach. The year was 1892, and in the quiet coastal town of Ipswich, Massachusetts, the Whitmore estate stood as a symbol of old New England wealth. A three-story federal-style mansion with clapboard siding spread across 5 acres overlooking the marshes, where the Ipswich River met the Atlantic. The house had belonged to the Whitmore family for 3 generations, ever since Elias Whitmore, a shipping magnate, built it in 1803. His portrait still hangs in the town hall. By the late 1800s, the family's shipping empire had faded, but their name and influence remained strong. What started as small, strange events inside that grand home soon became one of the most disturbing cases the county had ever seen. The mystery stayed hidden until 1965, when a student at Salem State College stumbled upon a metal box in the courthouse archives. Inside were yellowed, water-stained documents labeled Unresolved Matters 1890 to 1900. That student, Margaret Atwood, had been studying local shipping trade when she uncovered the Whitmore case, a name she recognized from the old mansion that once overlooked the marshes before it was torn down. On March 17, 1892, the Essex County Register published a brief notice. Thaddeus Whitmore, head of the family, reported his wife, Eleanor, missing. She was last seen 3 days earlier on her way to visit her sister in Rowley, but she never arrived. The article was just 3 paragraphs buried on page 7, yet it marked the beginning of a chilling story that would eventually consume the entire Whitmore household. Eleanor was described as a kind and respected woman, her disappearance causing great concern in Ipswich. Sheriff Thomas Caldwell organized a search party along the route to the train station, but no trace of her was ever found. Thaddeus Whitmore, then 49, was well regarded in town. A former sea captain turned businessman, he carried himself with authority. He lived in the mansion with Eleanor, their daughter Charlotte, age 20, and their son William, 17. They also employed 3 servants, longtime housekeeper Agatha Collins, handyman Martin Reynolds, and young Sarah Jenkins, who worked in the kitchen and served as Charlotte's maid. Outwardly, the Whitmores appeared to embody New England respectability. Thaddeus sat on the town council and gave generously to the church, while Eleanor chaired the Ladies' Aid Society. Charlotte was admired for her piano playing, and William was preparing to attend Harvard that fall. The family often hosted elegant gatherings, where Eleanor served her famous currant cakes, while Thaddeus discussed business with fellow merchants. But behind the polished image of their federal-style home, there were already cracks forming in the foundation of their family life. Records from the Ipswich Historical Society show that the winter of 1891 into 1892 was especially brutal, with heavy snow cutting off the town for weeks at a time. That harsh season seemed to mark the beginning of deeper troubles inside the Whitmore estate. The Whitmore estate, tucked at the end of a private drive off what is now County Street, felt even more isolated during that long winter. Martin Reynolds, the family's groundskeeper, later told investigators that Thaddeus Whitmore had grown increasingly withdrawn, often working late into the night in his study, with the lamp glowing like a beacon across the marsh. Reynolds recalled seeing him pacing the property at odd hours, stopping at the water's edge, as if searching for something or lost in troubling thoughts. When Reynolds asked if he needed help, Thaddeus brushed him off, insisting he was only out for air. The first signs of deeper unease appeared in the town physician's records. Dr. James Harrison was called to the Whitmore home 6 times between November 1891 and February 1892. Supposedly to treat Eleanor for nervous exhaustion and female hysteria. Catch-all diagnoses of the time for women showing anxiety or despair. He prescribed rest isolation and valerian tincture. But in his February 13th entry, he scrawled a telling note in the margin. Patient appears more fearful than ill. Speaks of being watched. Husband dismissive. In later testimony, Dr. Harrison admitted Eleanor showed none of the usual symptoms of hysteria. Instead, she looked like a woman under great strain, her voice low and hesitant, especially when her husband was present. On his last visit, she clutched his arm and whispered, "Please, doctor, I am not imagining things." He later regretted not pressing her for more. Housekeeper Agatha Collins gave a statement in April 1892 that revealed how rapidly things inside the mansion had shifted. She described Eleanor as increasingly nervous after the new year, jumping at small sounds and spending long hours staring from her bedroom window as though expecting someone in the dark beyond the marsh. The warmth that once softened her reserved marriage was gone. By January, she stiffened at her husband's presence, while Thaddeus watched her so intently that even the servants grew uneasy. Dinner, once lively with Charlotte's talk of music and William's excitement about Harvard, became heavy with silence, broken only by Thaddeus's curt remarks. The servants whispered that arguments echoed behind closed doors, though words were never clear. Sarah Jenkins, the young maid, recalled that Eleanor had taken to locking her bedroom door at night, unheard of in that household. Sarah heard pacing the scrape of pen on paper and once saw her hide something under a loose floorboard by her dressing table. Instead of scolding, Eleanor looked almost relieved. "Sarah," she said, "there may come a time when someone needs to know where to look." The meaning became chillingly clear only later. Then came the morning of March 14th, 1892. At breakfast, Eleanor announced she would visit her sister Catherine Perkins in Rowley. Thaddeus claimed he offered her the carriage, but she declined, saying she preferred to catch the 11:30 train from Ipswich station. She packed a small valise, just enough for a few days away, and with that decision, the last thread of her presence in the Whitmore home was set in place. Sarah Jenkins's memory of that morning offers a chilling layer to the story. She recalled how Mrs. Whitmore seemed strangely composed, almost as if she had already accepted her fate. Dressed in her dark blue traveling gown, with pearl buttons and her mother's cameo brooch at her throat, she appeared elegant but somber. As Sarah helped her with her hat, Eleanor pressed a sealed envelope into her hand and whispered, "Give this to Charlotte if I am not back in 3 days." When Sarah tried to ask what she meant, Eleanor only shook her head and murmured, "Some things cannot be spoken aloud in this house." According to Thaddeus, he was in his study buried in correspondence at the time of her departure. Charlotte, unaware of her mother's intentions, was practicing piano in the parlor. William was in town meeting with his Harvard entrance examiner. From the kitchen window, Mrs. Collins watched Eleanor step out the front door at about 10:45 a.m., walking steadily down the long drive toward County Street. She never looked back at the house, Collins later testified. That struck me as strange somehow. When 3 days passed without word, Thaddeus finally contacted the authorities. At first, few were alarmed. Bad weather had rolled in on March 15th, and many assumed she had simply extended her stay with her sister. A telegram was sent to Catherine Perkins in Rowley, but the reply that arrived that night turned a minor absence into a full-blown mystery. Catherine had not seen her sister at all. She had been expecting her, but assumed the storm had delayed the visit. Her telegram preserved in the files read, "No sign of Eleanor. Stop. Have not heard from her. Stop. Is something wrong? Query arriving Ipswich tomorrow morning. Stop." Catherine's later statement added troubling context. Eleanor had written to her the week before, saying she needed to discuss an urgent family matter in person. Though the letter was vague, it carried a sense of unease. She mentioned having discovered something that changes everything Catherine explained. I thought it might concern Charlotte's marriage prospects or William's education, but now I fear it was something far more grave. Sheriff Thomas Caldwell began a formal inquiry. Deputies questioned the station master, Frederick Simons, who confirmed selling Eleanor a ticket for the 11:30 train to Rowley on March 14th. But he could not swear she had boarded. No other passengers recalled seeing her that day. Deputies checked Rowley and Newport, the next stop on the line, but found no witnesses. A description was circulated: a woman of medium height, auburn hair, dark blue traveling dress, and a small brown leather valise. The case might have ended as another unresolved disappearance had it not been for Charlotte's discovery 2 weeks later. On March 29th, while searching through her mother's sewing basket, Charlotte uncovered a folded letter dated March 13th, the very day before her disappearance. Addressed simply, "To my dearest daughter," the note read, "My dearest Charlotte, should anything happen to me, know that I have not abandoned you willingly. For some time now, I have felt a darkness growing within these walls. Your father is not the man you believe him to be. I have discovered things, terrible things, that I cannot commit to paper. Trust no one in this house save yourself. Look to the accounts. The truth lies in the numbers. With all my love and in haste, Mother." Instead of sharing the letter with her father, Charlotte took it directly to Sheriff Caldwell. For a young woman in 1892, this was an extraordinary act, suggesting that she too suspected her father's hand in her mother's disappearance. In her statement, Charlotte admitted she had noticed her mother's growing unease since Christmas. She had always been gentle and content with her household duties, but in those months, she became watchful, almost secretive. When father entered a room, she would fall silent. More than once, I found her in his study while he was away, going through his papers. When I asked why, she would only smile and say, "A wife should take an interest in her husband's affairs." But there was something in Eleanor's behavior that hinted at far more than casual interest in her husband's affairs. When Sheriff Caldwell confronted Thaddeus Whitmore with the letter, his response was cold and calculated. He brushed it aside as nothing more than the ramblings of a troubled mind, pointing to Dr. Harrison's earlier notes as proof. My wife, Thaddeus insisted, had been suffering from paranoid delusions for months. She accused me of tampering with her food, of moving her belongings, even of reading her letters. I tolerated these accusations out of concern for her health, but this letter is only further evidence of her decline. Caldwell, though, was unconvinced. The timing of the letter was too precise, its warnings too deliberate. He ordered a full search of the estate and the marshlands surrounding it. For nearly 2 weeks, nothing turned up. Then, on April 3rd, Deputy Frank Morris stumbled upon a torn scrap of dark blue fabric snagged on a bramble along the marsh path that led from the Whitmore estate. The cloth bore a pearl button still fastened to it, identical to those on Eleanor's traveling dress. The edges of the tear were fresh, not frayed by weather. To Charlotte, who identified it immediately, the discovery was damning. Attention shifted back to Thaddeus, and investigators began dismantling his alibi. Mrs. Collins had indeed brought him tea in his study that afternoon. Sarah Jenkins had heard Charlotte playing the piano, and William's meeting with his Harvard examiner in town was confirmed. Yet subtle cracks appeared. Martin Reynolds, the groundskeeper, reported that the family carriage had been caked in marsh mud on the morning of March 15th. When he mentioned it to Thaddeus, his employer explained he had taken the carriage out for a solitary drive the previous evening to clear his head. Reynolds found this explanation odd, especially given the storm that made travel miserable that night. Caldwell pressed further, recalling Eleanor's warning to her daughter. Look to the accounts. The truth lies in the numbers. With a court order in hand, the sheriff gained access to the Whitmore family ledgers. What they revealed painted a picture of a crumbling fortune, hidden beneath the family's polished veneer. The once prosperous shipping investments were in sharp decline, several properties mortgaged, and large sums quietly siphoned from accounts in the months leading to Eleanor's disappearance. Even more alarming was a change in Thaddeus's will executed just weeks earlier in February. Eleanor had been removed as beneficiary. Instead, the estate would go to Charlotte and William, with Thaddeus's brother Julian serving as trustee until they came of age. Alongside this was another suspicious entry. Eleanor's personal inheritance, a substantial trust from her father, had been transferred into accounts under Thaddeus's sole control. The paperwork bore Eleanor's signature, but her sister Catherine swore she had never mentioned such a transfer and would never have surrendered control of her inheritance willingly. When pressed, Thaddeus stuck to his story. The financial maneuvers he claimed were responsible adjustments meant to safeguard the family's stability during hard times. The changes to the will, he argued, were necessary to shield the children's future from their mother's reckless spending and fragile state of mind. Yet investigators found no evidence of extravagance in Eleanor's habits. To those who studied the ledgers, the picture that emerged was not of a prudent man, but of one growing desperate and perhaps willing to go to deadly lengths to maintain control. The investigation shifted dramatically on April 7th, when Martin Reynolds, the groundskeeper, quietly sought out Sheriff Caldwell. Speaking in confidence, Reynolds admitted that on the night of March 14th, just hours after Mrs. Whitmore was last seen, he had been startled awake by the sound of the family carriage moving across the yard. From his loft above the stables, he saw Thaddeus himself driving down the marsh road at an hour when no respectable man would have business abroad. What struck Reynolds most was the way the horses strained under the weight of a heavy load. When the carriage returned nearly 2 hours later, it was noticeably lighter. Fear for his livelihood had kept Reynolds silent. "Mr. Whitmore pays my wages, and I have a family to feed," but his conscience would no longer allow him to withhold what he had seen. Caldwell acted quickly. The marsh road led not to town, but to a lonely stretch of shoreline where the Whitmore Shipping Company once operated a small private dock. Though long unused for trade, the rotting piers still jutted into the frigid Atlantic, a place only reachable by boat or by that private road from the estate. On April 8th, with the tide unusually low, a search party combed the marshes. Their efforts yielded a single haunting find, a woman's boot half buried in silt near the dock. It was quickly recognized by Charlotte and Mrs. Collins as Eleanor's, its slightly raised heel and small brass buckle distinctive to her favored pair. The discovery carried heavy implications. Few outsiders would have reason to wander that remote stretch of coast, especially in March. For investigators, it suggested not chance, but intent. Sheriff Caldwell summoned Thaddeus for formal questioning, holding him through 7 grueling hours. Whitmore held firm in his denials. He claimed his wife's mind had been unraveling and that she might have gone to the dock herself, perhaps to end her life. She often spoke of failing as a wife and mother, he explained. The dock was meaningful to us. If she contemplated something drastic, that is where she would have gone. When pressed about his midnight drive, the very night of her disappearance, Thaddeus admitted he had taken the carriage out, but framed it as an anxious husband searching for his troubled wife. I could not sleep. Something in her manner that morning had seemed final. I thought perhaps she had gone to the dock instead of her sisters. When I found nothing, I returned. I did not speak of it before because I feared how it might be interpreted. Despite growing suspicions, the sheriff had no body and no proof strong enough to hold him. Thaddeus was released, though the stain of suspicion clung to him. The Whitmore family quickly became pariahs in Ipswich. Invitations to dinners and teas ceased. Neighbors crossed to the opposite side of the street rather than exchange pleasantries. The grand estate that once symbolized respectability now loomed as a house of whispers and unanswered questions. By mid-April, the Whitmore family was no longer just whispered about in Ipswich. They had become a symbol of scandal. Charlotte and William were quietly kept home from church to avoid the stares and muttered suspicions. On April 15th, the Ipswich Chronicle ran a front-page piece headlined, "Mystery Deepens in Whitmore Disappearance." The article laid out the known facts and quoted townsfolk who described the family as once respected, but now under a cloud. Its closing line a reminder that, in America, a man is innocent until proven guilty, only underscored the reality the town already believed Thaddeus guilty. Inside the estate, the atmosphere grew suffocating. Sarah Jenkins later testified that Thaddeus became increasingly authoritarian. He forbade his children from leaving the property without his permission and demanded they avoid speaking to anyone about family matters. He had new locks installed on every exterior door and carried the keys himself. Curtains stayed drawn, the piano fell silent, and meals were joyless affairs, often taken in separate rooms. Thaddeus shut himself in his study for hours, emerging only to bark instructions or interrogate Charlotte about her movements. The once bright young woman now glided through the halls like a shadow, careful not to draw attention. William, initially loyal, began to waver. Sarah overheard a heated exchange between father and son, after which William stormed out of the study with reddened eyes. The next morning, he packed a bag, announcing plans to stay with a school friend in Boston until Harvard term began. Before leaving, he met Charlotte in the garden, away from prying ears. Sarah, watching from an upstairs window, saw them speaking urgently for nearly an hour. Charlotte broke down in tears. William embraced her and pressed a small object into her hand before departing. Charlotte retreated deeper into her mother's world. She spent long hours in Eleanor's room, sifting through garments, letters, and keepsakes. To Mrs. Collins, she claimed to be looking for a particular brooch, but her methodical searching suggested she was after something more. Her persistence was rewarded on April 22nd, nearly 6 weeks after her mother's disappearance, when she discovered a hidden diary tucked into the false bottom of her mother's jewelry box. The diary painted a damning picture of Thaddeus's secret life. In it, Eleanor documented late-night meetings, missing financial papers, and overheard fragments of conversations hinting at illicit dealings. More chilling were her accounts of her husband's shifting demeanor, the cold stares, his intrusion into her letters, and his veiled threats. One entry from February 3rd described how he returned home late, smelling of smoke, though he denied visiting taverns. She found in his coat pocket a letter addressed to someone named Wells in Boston, referencing our arrangement and absolute discretion. When she dared mention the name the next morning, Thaddeus went pale. Another entry dated February 18th revealed the full scope of betrayal. "I am now convinced he has been systematically transferring funds from my inheritance," Eleanor wrote. "The bank statements he shows me are fabrications. I verified this today with Mr. Patterson at First National. Nearly half of my father's legacy is gone. When I confronted him, he denied everything, then threatened to have Dr. Harrison commit me to Danvers Asylum if I continue to speak of it. I must be careful now." The final note, written on March 13th, was a terse warning to herself. "He knows that I know. I saw it in his eyes at dinner. I must get to Catherine tomorrow and bring her the papers. If I wait, it may be too late." The discovery changed everything. Sheriff Caldwell, armed with the diary, obtained a warrant to search Thaddeus's study in greater depth. Behind a loose panel in the wainscoting, deputies uncovered a locked metal box. Inside lay correspondence with business associates in Boston and New York, exposing the framework of a fraudulent scheme. At its center was a shell company Thaddeus had created. Atlantic Maritime Ventures, a company that existed only on paper, but which he presented to investors as a bustling shipping enterprise, trading with the West Indies. Thaddeus Whitmore's financial deception now stood in stark relief. Using the prestige of the Whitmore name and his standing in Ipswich society, he had drawn in investors with promises of lucrative returns from ventures that never existed. At the center of this web of deceit was a letter from businessman Harrison Wells. The tone was unmistakably threatening. Unless compensated further, Wells would reveal everything. Consider carefully what exposure would mean for a man of your standing. Wells warned not merely financial ruin, but imprisonment. What would your wife say if she knew the truth about Dartmouth shipping? The mention of Dartmouth shipping proved especially damning. Several documents tied the company to Eleanor's family inheritance. Without her knowledge, Thaddeus had used it as collateral for loans, a direct violation of Massachusetts law. Alongside this was a ledger showing that Thaddeus's debts had ballooned to over $50,000, a staggering amount for 1892. The most recent entry, dated March 10th, revealed an increasingly desperate man. He had tried to secure yet another loan from a Boston bank offering properties that had already been pledged elsewhere as collateral. Sheriff Caldwell now had a clear motive. Eleanor had uncovered her husband's fraudulent dealings. Her diary, her letter to Charlotte, and Wells's threat painted a picture of a woman who had pieced together enough to ruin him, and of a man with everything to lose. On April 25, 1892, Thaddeus Whitmore was arrested on suspicion of murdering his wife. The arrest rocked Ipswich and all of Essex County. The Boston Globe splashed the story across its April 26th front page under the headline, "Prominent Ipswich Businessman Arrested in Wife's Disappearance." The article outlined Thaddeus's distinguished lineage, the shock of the town, and included a statement from Reverend Jonathan Pembroke of the First Congregational Church. "Mr. Whitmore has always been a pillar of our community." These accusations are difficult to reconcile with the man I have known for 20 years. Yet for all the uproar, the case against him remained circumstantial. There was no body, no weapon, no direct evidence tying him to murder. His attorney, the well-connected Boston lawyer Harrison Montgomery, quickly set to work dismantling the prosecution's case. Montgomery argued that Eleanor, upon discovering her husband's schemes, may have fled of her own accord. "The Commonwealth has produced no body, no murder weapon, and no direct evidence of foul play," Montgomery wrote in a motion. "They have shown that Mr. Whitmore was engaged in questionable financial practices and that Mrs. Whitmore may have discovered these activities. But this establishes motive for her departure, not her death." He suggested Eleanor had taken the incriminating papers with her, perhaps to prepare for divorce and safeguard her inheritance. Then came the storm. On May 7th, a powerful surge tore through the marshlands near the old Whitmore dock, eroding banks and exposing what had been hidden beneath the waterline. Local fisherman Henry Marsh stumbled upon the grisly find partial human remains. The county medical examiner quickly identified them as belonging to a woman matching Eleanor's age and stature. More damning still was the gold locket recovered among the remains, holding a tiny portrait of Charlotte as a child, a piece of jewelry Eleanor was known never to remove. Though badly decomposed from weeks in salt water, the remains told their own story. The examiner, Dr. Edward Simmons, noted a severe fracture to the right parietal bone consistent with a crushing blow from a blunt object. This injury, his report read, would likely have been fatal and appears to have been inflicted prior to immersion. The discovery confirmed what the Whispers of Ipswich had long suspected: Eleanor Whitmore had not vanished of her own accord. She had been struck down and cast into the marshes, her death concealed beneath tide and silence until the sea itself gave her back. The trial of Thaddeus Whitmore opened on August 15, 1892, inside the granite walls of the Essex County Courthouse in Salem. The atmosphere was electric, with reporters crowding in from Boston and New York, and locals lining up at dawn for seats. Judge Alden Richardson presided, his stern presence setting the tone for what quickly became one of the most closely watched trials in county history. The 12 jurors, carefully selected from towns outside Ipswich to reduce prejudice, settled into their seats as District Attorney Robert Gaskell laid out the prosecution's narrative. Gaskell's opening statement was crisp and unflinching. Gentlemen of the jury, this case before you is not merely about the disappearance of a respected woman. It is about the calculated destruction of a human life to protect a web of deception. He argued that Thaddeus, desperate to conceal his fraudulent dealings, silenced his wife to prevent exposure, then drove her body to the marsh where he weighted it down in the tidal waters, hoping the sea would erase the evidence. The defense, led by the formidable Boston attorney Harrison Montgomery, countered with a strategy of doubt. He reminded the jury that no one had witnessed the crime and that the remains found were consistent with drowning, as much as with violence. Eleanor, he argued, had long suffered melancholy and could have taken her own life after discovering her husband's betrayals. Yes, Montgomery admitted, Mr. Whitmore erred gravely in his business affairs. But there is a vast gulf between financial impropriety and murder. His task was not to prove Thaddeus innocent, but to plant the seed of uncertainty. Over the next 3 weeks, the prosecution painstakingly built its case. Dr. James Harrison testified that Eleanor's demeanor in her final months was not of a woman contemplating suicide, but of one living in fear. Financial experts explained how Thaddeus's empire had crumbled by March, laying bare the motive. Martin Reynolds described the midnight drive on March 14th and the carriage straining under a hidden load. The defense worked tirelessly to discredit each witness. They suggested Dr. Harrison had misread signs of depression, that Reynolds' testimony was colored by resentment after a recent reprimand, and they paraded character witnesses who painted Thaddeus as a man of principle and community standing. Then came Charlotte. Called to the stand, she sat pale and composed, her voice steady as she described her mother's growing anxiety and her father's increasing secrecy. My mother was not prone to fancies, she said. She was practical. But by the end of winter, she lived in fear. My father would shut himself away, and my mother spent her time gathering documents, writing notes, watching him. When asked directly if she believed her father capable of killing her mother, Charlotte hesitated, a silence that seemed to stretch endlessly before answering, "I no longer know the man who raised me." William's testimony cut even deeper. He told the jury how on the morning after Eleanor vanished, he had seen his father's best leather boots caked with thick black marsh mud. "My father was meticulous about his boots," he explained. Never would he have tracked them through the house. Yet that morning they were coated in the mud I knew from the marshes. Those boots later vanished, never recovered during the sheriff's search. The combination of Charlotte's heartbreak and William's damning observation shifted the tone of the courtroom. What had begun as a battle over financial records and diary entries had become a story of children testifying against their father, the man who had ruled their home. The jury listened in silence, their expressions grave as the case against Thaddeus moved from suspicion to something that felt dangerously close to certainty. The trial's intensity reached its peak when Harrison Wells himself took the stand. Heavy-set with a waxed mustache that gleamed under the gaslights, Wells commanded attention as he recounted his dealings with Thaddeus Whitmore. He explained how 2 years earlier Thaddeus had lured him into investing in Atlantic maritime ventures with promises of remarkable returns. Over time, Wells poured in nearly $12,000, a staggering sum. But by January, suspicions grew. When I pressed Mr. Whitmore for records of ships and cargo, Wells testified, he became evasive. Hiring a private investigator, Wells learned the devastating truth. Atlantic Maritime Ventures had no ships, no cargo, no existence beyond paper. When Wells confronted him, Thaddeus first offered excuses, then threats. He implied that Wells's in-laws, politically connected to the governor, would be smeared if Wells pursued the matter publicly. Only after Wells threatened full exposure did Thaddeus agree to return part of the money. Then in early March, Wells received a letter that chilled him. It was from Eleanor Whitmore. She wrote that she had uncovered discrepancies in her husband's affairs and begged for a private meeting in Boston on March 16th. Wells agreed, but Eleanor never arrived. The implication was clear: she had been silenced before she could reveal the truth. The prosecution's final blow came from Eleanor's sister, Catherine Perkins. Regal in her grief, she testified that Eleanor's letters in February had been increasingly desperate. Eleanor wrote of seeking refuge with her children, of needing her husband's legal expertise, and of papers requiring immediate action. Her last letter, dated March 12th, revealed a clear plan: she would arrive alone on March 14th to discuss documents, and urged secrecy. Thaddeus must not know. When Catherine produced this letter in court, witnesses noted Thaddeus blanching, his composure cracking for the first time. The next day, newspapers across Massachusetts highlighted this moment, framing it as the instant the community saw guilt flash across his face. The defense responded by doubling down on doubt. Montgomery called a medical expert who claimed Eleanor's fractured skull could have been caused by rocks in the marsh rather than deliberate violence. He painted her increasing isolation and secret correspondence as the actions of a woman preparing to leave her husband, not expose him. The missing documents, he argued, might have been the foundation of a quiet divorce. In his closing argument, Montgomery turned to the jury with deliberate gravity. "Gentlemen, you have been asked to send a man to his death based on supposition, inference, and conjecture. Yes, Mr. Whitmore engaged in financial improprieties. Yes, his marriage was strained. Yes, he drove to the marsh on the night his wife disappeared. But none of these facts proves murder. Without a body intact, without a weapon, without a witness, how can the Commonwealth demand that you condemn a man forever?" The courtroom sat hushed as Montgomery's words echoed, leaving the jurors to weigh whether the mosaic of evidence amounted to a picture of guilt or a shadow of doubt. Montgomery's closing plea urged the jury to remember the cornerstone of American justice: innocence, until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. "The prosecution has shown you fragments of a puzzle," he said, "but they cannot present the complete picture because it does not exist. Coincidence has been twisted into conspiracy. Do not condemn a man to a living death on supposition and inference." His words hung heavy in the hushed courtroom. District Attorney Gaskell rose for the final rebuttal and delivered a summation that the Boston Globe would later describe as searing in its clarity. He reminded the jury of the pattern they had seen. The defendant would have you believe in a cascade of coincidences that his wife uncovered his fraudulent dealings and then by chance disappeared. That he by chance drove his carriage to the marsh on the very night she vanished. That her remains by chance were found near his dock, bearing injuries consistent with violent assault. Ladies and gentlemen, these are not coincidences. They are links in a chain of evidence that leads inexorably to one conclusion: Thaddeus Whitmore, facing ruin and disgrace, murdered his wife to silence her. Eleanor Whitmore deserves justice. Her children deserve truth. And this community deserves protection from a man who has proven he would stop at nothing, not even murder, to protect his pride and reputation. On September 3, 1892, after 3 tense days of deliberation, the jury delivered its verdict: guilty. The sentence was life imprisonment at Massachusetts State Prison in Charlestown. Thaddeus stood stone still as the words were read, his expression unreadable. According to the Boston Herald, his only words spoken in a low voice to his children were, "Charlotte, William, remember me as I was not as they claim I am." The verdict shattered what remained of the Whitmore family. Charlotte, unable to endure the whispers and cold stares of Ipswich society, sold the estate for a fraction of its worth and sailed to Europe, where she reportedly settled in Switzerland. She never returned to American soil. The great Whitmore mansion, stripped of its heirs, sat empty for months before being purchased by Boston merchant George Harrington as a summer retreat. But the Harringtons never settled comfortably. Mrs. Harrington refused to sleep in the master bedroom, saying the air itself felt heavy there. William abandoned his long-anticipated plans for Harvard and enlisted in the Army. He served in the Spanish-American War, but succumbed to yellow fever in Cuba in 1898, leaving no descendants. Among his meager possessions was a curious item, a small gold key on a chain its purpose never explained. The Whitmore mansion passed from one owner to the next, never holding a family for long. No ghosts were ever reported, but the weight of tragedy seemed etched into its walls. Locals dubbed it the Murder House, and by 1927 it was demolished to make way for a new coastal road. As for Thaddeus, he lived out his days in Charlestown prison. Records describe him as a model inmate, quiet, cooperative, and devoted to teaching arithmetic to illiterate prisoners. He worked in the library and caused no trouble, but he never received a single visitor in 14 years. In 1906, he died of pneumonia at age 63. His final letter to the prison chaplain read, "I have been punished not for what I did to Eleanor, but for what I failed to be for her." That is justice of a kind, I suppose. When he died, his few possessions, a Bible, a pocket watch, and a small photograph of Charlotte and William as children, were sent to his brother Julian in Chicago. For decades, the Whitmore case remained a cautionary tale in Essex County lore, a grim story of wealth, pride, and ruin. But in 1904, a discovery by Sarah Jenkins would breathe new life into the mystery and raise unsettling questions about whether the full truth of what happened to Eleanor Whitmore had ever been known. Sarah Jenkins' 1904 revelation reopened old wounds in Essex County and cast long shadows over what many had believed was a settled case. Having left the Whitmore household after the trial and finding work with a family in Newburyport, she carried a burden of silence for more than a decade. In her sworn statement to the Essex County prosecutor, she disclosed what Charlotte had confided to her in secret before departing for Europe, that the diary introduced at trial was incomplete. According to Jenkins, Charlotte had discovered the full version of her mother's writings, and within its pages were entries pointing to a life Eleanor had long dreamed of reclaiming. The diary spoke of James Thornfield, a widowed acquaintance from her youth, with whom Eleanor had resumed correspondence in the autumn of 1891. The entries hinted at plans for her to leave Ipswich, possibly to Montreal, where Thornfield maintained business ties. Jenkins further testified that Charlotte had also found letters hidden in her mother's desk letters, in which Thornfield described purchasing property under Eleanor's maiden name and depositing funds in a Canadian bank. Jenkins claimed Charlotte admitted she had concealed this evidence, believing her father's ruin was just retribution for his fraud and cruelty, regardless of whether he was directly guilty of murder. "He deserves punishment for what he did to our family, whether or not he killed Mother Charlotte," allegedly told her. Bound by an oath of silence until after Mr. Whitmore's death, Jenkins had held her tongue for 12 years. With Thaddeus gone, she felt compelled to reveal the truth. The prosecutor's office reviewed her statement, but declined to reopen the case. By then, the conviction was nearly a generation old, and the evidence Jenkins described could not be verified. Thus, Thaddeus's guilt remained fixed in the public record, though the new testimony suggested alternative possibilities, that Eleanor may have intended to disappear on her own, only to suffer an accident in the marsh, or that the fatal confrontation with Thaddeus had roots in passion and betrayal, rather than cold financial calculation. The significance of Jenkins's account might have faded into obscurity had it not been rediscovered in 1965 by historian Margaret Atwood while researching for her book on notorious Essex County crimes. Atwood found tucked in archives not only Jenkins's statement, but also private correspondence between Charlotte and William written after the trial. One letter from October 1892 revealed Charlotte's gnawing uncertainty. "Father is a criminal in his business dealings, of that I have no doubt. But did he kill Mother? The more I reflect on those final weeks, the less certain I become. And yet what difference does it make now? The verdict is rendered, and we are all serving life sentences of our own. Another letter, dated 1897, just before William shipped off to Cuba, hinted at something even more mysterious. I dreamt of Mother last night standing by the marsh. She asked if we had found it yet. You know what she meant, I think. Before you leave for this war, brother, should we not resolve that final question? The key you have and the box I discovered might contain the answer neither of us has been brave enough to seek. Together, these letters suggested that the Whitmore children carried secrets far beyond the courtroom drama that had condemned their father. Somewhere, perhaps still hidden in the ruins of the family estate or lost to time, there may have been a key and a box that held the final truth of Eleanor's fate. The most haunting twist in Margaret Atwood's research came with the discovery of a fragmentary letter written in Eleanor Whitmore's own hand, dated March 18, 1892, 4 days after she had supposedly vanished into the marshes. Found among Charlotte's belongings after her death in Geneva in 1951, the letter was addressed simply to my dearest children. It began with a confession. By now you must know I have gone. Please understand that this decision was not made lightly or without great pain. The life I have lived these past years has been a prison of propriety and secrets. Your father is not the man I married, and I can no longer bear witness to what he has become. I have secured means for us all to start anew away from Ipswich, away from the Whitmore name and all it has come to represent. Charlotte, William, when you receive word from me, I pray you will find the courage to... The letter ended there, abruptly unfinished. The implications were staggering. If genuine, it suggested Eleanor had indeed escaped her husband and planned to reunite with her children later. But no such word ever reached Charlotte or William. Was she intercepted by Thaddeus? Did she fall victim to accident or betrayal in her flight? Or had Charlotte herself fabricated the letter years later to justify her silence and her father's conviction? Atwood's pursuit of the truth carried her north to Montreal, where she unearthed records of a property purchased in February 1892 under the name Eleanor Prescott, Eleanor's maiden name. The house in a respectable neighborhood was resold in June 1892, never lived in. The purchaser, James Thornfield. His records showed he had left Montreal for Europe in April of that year, never to return. Thornfield's connection to Eleanor traced back decades. The son of a Boston merchant, he had once courted her before her family steered her toward the wealthier Whitmores. He later married, built a thriving import business with offices in Boston, New York, and Montreal, and was widowed in 1891. Eleanor's rediscovery of him widower, wealthy and free, aligned too perfectly with the diary hints of rekindled affection and plans for a new life abroad. The most compelling evidence surfaced in 1963 during the construction of a seawall near the ruins of the old Whitmore dock. Workers uncovered a corroded metal box, its contents waterlogged but partially preserved. Inside were documents tying Eleanor's secret plans to reality, a deed to the Montreal property signed Eleanor Prescott bank correspondence showing the transfer of funds from Boston, a one-way train ticket from Ipswich to Boston, dated March 14, 1892, and a steamship passage from Boston to Montreal, scheduled for March 16th. Most chilling of all was a faded diary entry written the very day she vanished March 14th. I leave today with mixed emotions. T suspects something I fear. Last night he questioned me about the missing documents from his study, documents that would prove his guilt. I told him nothing but his eyes. I have never seen such coldness there before. This final fragment leaves the case suspended in uncertainty. Did Eleanor board that train and vanish into her new identity as Eleanor Prescott, only to be overtaken before she could reach safety? Or did Thaddeus, aware of her intentions, intercept her in those final hours, his coldness becoming violence? The marshes with their shifting tides concealed much and revealed little. What endures is the sense of irresolution. Whitmore case remains one of Essex County's darkest enigmas. A story not simply of crime and punishment, but of fractured loyalties, hidden lives, and truths swallowed by time. The final act of the Whitmore saga is perhaps the most unsettling, because it leaves us with more questions than answers. In 1968, workmen renovating the old First National Bank in Ipswich unearthed a safety deposit box untouched since 1892. Records showed it had been rented by Eleanor Whitmore just 2 months before her disappearance. Inside, archivists found a journal that laid bare Thaddeus's financial deceptions, original documents proving his fraudulent schemes, and a letter to the Essex County District Attorney that Eleanor had never mailed. In it, she wrote, "Should anything happen to me, I beg you to look beyond the marshes, beyond the facade of respectability that shrouds the Whitmore name. The truth may not lie where it seems most obvious." But the most intriguing item was a small leather notebook filled with coded entries. With the help of a cryptographer historian, Margaret Atwood deciphered it as Eleanor's meticulous record of her secret financial preparations. She had quietly withdrawn funds, liquidated investments, and opened accounts in Montreal. The final entry, dated March 13, 1892, read, "All is prepared. Tomorrow, I leave this house forever. May God forgive me for abandoning my children, though I go to secure their future. When safe, I will send for them. T will not release them willingly. But the evidence I have gathered should provide sufficient leverage once I am beyond his reach." Tucked into the notebook was a hurried note in shakier script he knows. "Confronted me tonight about the missing papers. Threatened. Must leave immediately. Changed plan. Marsh path to avoid the house. Signal arranged with Martin to bring carriage to dock at midnight. Pray I reach C safely." This revelation suggested Eleanor's carefully plotted escape unraveled at the very last moment. Whether Thaddeus discovered her or whether the marsh itself claimed her in the darkness, no one can say. In 1972, another twist surfaced. Thomas Marsh, the son of fisherman Henry Marsh, who had originally discovered Eleanor's remains, confessed to a secret passed down on his father's deathbed. Henry had found more than bones and a locket that day in 1892. He had also uncovered a satchel buried in the silt containing cash, a train ticket, and letters linking Eleanor to James Thornfield. But fearing scandal, bound by religious beliefs, and indebted to Thaddeus for an old loan, Henry suppressed the evidence, later hiding the satchel in the family cemetery plot. His silence may have shaped the verdict that condemned Thaddeus to prison. Today, the Whitmore estate exists only in fragments. A crumbling stone wall in a forgotten garden, photographs of the dock long since consumed by tides, and whispers that cling to the Ipswich marshes. Locals speak of the tragedy not as a ghost story, but as something heavier, a reminder that the greatest horrors are not supernatural, but deeply human. Betrayal, desperation, and the collapse of carefully tended appearances can be more terrifying than any phantom. The Essex County Archives summarize the case with grim clarity. The Whitmore tragedy serves as a reminder that history's darkest chapters are often written not in moments of chaos, but in the quiet desperation of ordinary lives pushed beyond endurance. On still nights when the salt wind carries across the reeds, some say you can hear faint footsteps along the old marsh path, the echo of a woman walking toward freedom she would never reach.